Okay, so until now, I've kind of explained this to you guys a little bit. So this physiology class is um, primarily like the information. It's all about like how to pass that fourth chapter in your regular NASM textbook, right? Like it's all about getting through that metabolism chapter. And so we're going to give you a lot of like extended information beyond in the world of physiology. So like, and some of this information is from chapters, 2 and 3 as well. But the whole ATP chapter, right? Like the cardio, how we produce energy and things like that, understanding energy systems is that fourth chapter in your textbook. And so today we are actually going to go through the slides that directly correspond with that chapter. So this is the second half of this whole course is starting today, right? Like this is our 7th day in PFT 105 out of our 12. So we're going to do another 5 days through the schedule here. And this second half is really all about like the training side of it. So what we're doing is we're kind of circling back around today to review all the energy systems again so that we can understand how to break them down separately in the next coming days. So this is almost like a preview of everything to come, all wrapped up into like one big lecture. It's actually relatively short. Like there's actually not that many slides in this chapter by itself because it's literally just going to review the energy systems. But that's the only thing we're talking about today. Like on the first day, we talked about energy systems. We ended up getting more into like cellular biology than we did just staying on energy systems. Today, we are strictly looking at energy systems. We're also going to introduce one more system today, which is like sort of a precursor to the energy production systems. You'll know what I mean by that here in just a minute. But the thing I always like to, the reason I like to do like a special little intro whenever I teach this PowerPoint is if you forget everything from this whole course, or if you have been not paying attention this entire time and you also intend not to pay attention for the rest of things, today's the day. Like this is the one from your book. Like a lot of the other stuff is like way more in depth than your book is. You know what I mean? Like we go way deeper than we need to. Today is what you need to. I guess. I don't know. That sentence didn't make any sense, but it sounded good. But like today is the day where like what we're going over corresponds directly with the chapter. Nothing more, nothing less. So, all right. So we are looking at PFT 105. And it is going to be PowerPoint 6, Exercise, Metabolism, and Bioenergetics. That is actually, again, that's the name of the chapter in your textbook, is Exercise, Metabolism, and Bioenergetics. So a lot of the vocabulary, I mean, honestly, like as much as it is only 20 sides, and it will move pretty quickly because it's short compared to some of the other ones, we definitely want to pay really close attention to a lot of the vocab terms because Lord, we all know NASM loves to use vocab terms as questions on their tests. So, all right, so the purpose of today's lecture, right, we want to provide basic information on energy metabolism and bioenergetics, and that will help be useful in helping us, plan effective exercise programs, right? We're going to be able to stay in the right energy systems, which are going to result in the right energy production, which will result in like the right types of strength and muscle gains and things like that. So we want to be able to kind of describe the primary methods for how we produce energy. Again, the energy systems themselves, differentiate between what is aerobic versus anaerobic, which metabolic pathways are predominated by like which intensity. So like, if you're doing high intensity, what pathway does that kind of force you into? The anaerobic one, right? Because like short duration means anaerobic and high intensity means short duration, right? So we need to be able to kind of understand that. So here are, right in a row, 3. It's so funny, like a lot of this, it's like feels like we're going to be copying the PowerPoints directly, and it's like putting them into your notes because we're definitely going to see a lot of terms today. So one of the big ones is bioenergetics itself. So what is bioenergetics? Right, it is the study of how energy is transformed through various biochemical reactions, right? How did you guys take those hamburgers and hot dogs from this weekend and convert them into push-ups and lunges and things like that? That's bioenergetics. Maggie, you're like, oh, no. It's the 4th of July weekend. Surely somebody out there barbecued. You know, it's funny. I barbecued, and so we had like hot dogs and burgers. And for the sake of it, they were on sale super cheap, and I was curious. I picked up Beyond Burgers, like the plant-based, like ones that like bleed. And I like made them, and they were really good. Like they were better than the other hamburgers I made because like the other hamburgers I made were also relatively cheap, but tasted like it.
Did it taste like beef?
They really did, yeah. And I had like leftovers, so this week that's what I used for meal prep. So now I'm using them as, I mean, surely somebody else in here has done this, where it's like you just make a beef patty as your steak dinner. So I'm doing that all week as well. So they're pretty good. I was impressed. I was curious, and I cooked them, and they held up. I was really impressed. All right, so that's bioenergetics, right? How energy is transformed through various biochemical reactions, right? So how do we take food and convert it into work? Now, obviously, in order to understand that, we have to understand like metabolism. But we're going to look at metabolism from two different lenses here. We're going to look at regular old metabolism, which has that classic definition that we've already got in our notes, actually, which is any and all chemical reactions that occur in the body to maintain itself, right? So it's literally any reaction. If it's chemical, that's part of your metabolism. But there's sort of a subversion here that's also, you know, very specific to us, and that's your exercise metabolism. Now, obviously, your exercise metabolism isn't like different metabolism, right? It's not like your cells producing special types of energy or anything like that. We just use the term exercise metabolism because it is a way for us to describe how like metabolism is functioning during exercise, right? So this is like, it's not different than your normal. It's just, it's the whenever we're talking about like duration under reps, duration under a sprint or a jog or something like that, that's what we're going to refer to as like exercise metabolism, quote unquote. And that's why like there is actually a slight difference here when you are describing like the energy systems for your average like biology student. You're describing like glycolysis and aerobic metabolism, right? So you get step 1, you get step 2, and you know, step 2 has its little individual parts. But when we're describing exercise metabolism, we've got to go to a precursor that starts before glycolysis. And it's the ATP-PC system, or the phosphagen system, if we want to call it that. And so that's why we kind of have its own, almost have its own special term. So that is the examination, the examination of bioenergetics as it relates to the unique physiologic changes and demands placed on the body during exercise. So it's like, you know, this is your unique metabolism that you would use to function during a workout, right? As another sort of short, quick little review here, the big thing we need to remember about like metabolism, right, is that you're going to take what are called substrates and break them down to produce energy. And substrates are your essential nutrients, right? Or at least they are the pieces of your essential nutrients. Like when we think of nutrients, we think of like a carbohydrate. That's like a large example, right? Because there's about a bunch of different versions of carbohydrates. But carbohydrates can't, on their own be used for energy unless they get broken down into a source that we can use, which is like glucose. Glucose can be used to produce energy, right? And so your nutrient substrates that you've got are going to be your proteins, carbohydrates, and the lipids, aka fats. And those are all going to be used in different ways to produce energy. Protein, not directly, right? We don't actually use protein to produce energy, but we do take protein, break it down, convert it into glucose. Now it's a carbohydrate. Now we can use it to produce energy. Fat, that can kind of skip the glycolysis process and go straight to getting turned into acetyl-CoA, and boom, that can also produce energy. So we like them, but our primary, source, our favorite one is going to be carbohydrates, right? So we're talking about metabolism, right? We are describing how nutrient substrates get broken down into usable energy, right? And those are going to be, we got carbohydrates are used directly for metabolism. Fats are also used directly for metabolism. And then we have proteins, which are converted into glucose through what is called gluconeogenesis. And then that glucose is used for metabolism. Right, so proteins are going to get converted in through the process of gluconeogenesis, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then one thing that I also need to mention here, carbohydrates are definitely going to be the body's preferred favorite method for producing energy, right? Our favorite substrate by the body is going to be carbohydrates. Because glucose can be used in all energy systems under all situations, whereas like fat tends to rely on like aerobic metabolism. So that again is low intensity, long duration exercise. That's great. Your body can totally use that type of fuel source to produce ATP under a long duration, which, I mean, you guys are all in a long duration state right now, right? You're all sitting upright, you've been awake for a couple of hours, right? But if you start to raise your intensity super high, your body prefers to use like glucose as a fuel source for that first like 30 seconds. Then it kind of hands it off to your fat metabolism. And so like this is one of the things where we start to get into like a keto conversation, because people are like, wait. Keto diets are like purely fat diets, right? Like they have like 30 grams of carbohydrates a day at the most. That's the most you're allowed on like a keto diet, right? Think about that, 30 grams, that's going to be 120 calories out of however many calories you're consuming in a day, right? So that's what? Let's see here, I need a calculator. Let's say you're consuming like 2,500 calories a day, right? That is 4% of your overall calories coming from carbohydrates if you're on a ketogenic diet. So how the heck do they have their high intensity? Well, I mean, the simple answer is they don't really. They don't really go through the process of glycolysis. And so they've kind of lost that type of metabolism. And here's what's kind of hard. Has anybody in here ever done keto? Anybody ever tried, goofed around with it? Had any success? No? So it's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting like thing, because like it means that you're particularly bad at glycolysis. I mean, you don't really have glucose as a fuel source. Your body is, like I said, bypassing glycolysis to go straight into your aerobic metabolism. It's converting fat molecules into acetyl-CoA to go through the Krebs cycle. So it's starting there. So that means that you kind of lose intensity. You lose the high intensity activity that's associated with glycolysis. Glycolysis is meant to be like your booster button. It's meant to be like your really intense work. And now and what's really hard about that is, and I'll, if I had any keto defenders in here who are big keto fans, they'll go, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, I've been on keto and I work really, really hard. And it's one of those things where it's like, I believe that that's true, but this is also where the conversation of like hard versus intense, those are two totally different things. They're not even related. Like, hard is like the perception of something being difficult. Intense is a directly measurable percentage of your one repetition effort. So like intense is 85 or higher percent of your maximum effort. So like, it's not that you didn't work hard. Like, I would say like doing 100 push-ups is hard, but you will not hear me say 100 push-ups is intense. A marathon is hard. It is one of the least intense activities that we do. And that seems really surprising. You're like, oh my, it's like, what? You don't think a marathon's intense? You see people at the end of the marathons, it looks like they're ready to die, right? Like, they're like walking through the finish line, like, oh my God, I made it, and I collapse, like, it's hard. It's not intense, because a run is like step, 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 step. You can do a lot of them, right? Intense is something that you can only do a few of. And you lose that fuel source. Our body, whenever we're doing something that's intense, that's glycolysis. Whenever we're doing something that is, and intense can be hard as well. It just doesn't have to be. I'm sorry, hard can be intense. I mean, like a marathon is hard, but it's not intense. A sprint is hard and intense, like you also feel like you're intensely worn out afterwards. But you were also working at a very, very high percentage of your maximal effort. That's what makes it intense. So it's funny because like, you'll talk to people on keto and they're like, they're using fat as a fuel source. It's like, you're losing intensity. So it's not necessarily the world's greatest way to train for intense strength gain, or like hypertrophy gain. Not that those things can't happen. It's just not the best way to train for it. And that's really what I want to kind of dive into here. It still happens. It's not like doing exercise isn't going to result in gaining muscular size. But primarily, one of the best ways to like grow your body is to produce lactic acid as a byproduct and have that lactic acid sit on your muscles to damage your muscles, which then your body creates inflammation. And now you've created like the growth, and then your body builds based on that growth, right? So like, that's the best way to gain for size. It's not like it's not going to happen. It's just not the best version. And that's really what we kind of need to understand when I'm talking about energy systems here. That's why I like to kind of cue this conversation up. Is keto bad for you? No, that's not what I'm saying. Is it the best way to do certain things? Well, now the debate is a little longer, right? And that's really what these energy systems are here. Is 6 to 12 reps the best? Or is 12 to 20 reps the best? Or is 1 to 5 reps the best? I think that any version of that question is flawed, right? They all just are different energy systems. They result in different types of growth. So like, that question's broken. We can't answer. It's like, there is no best. There is just doing something that results in something else. And so if that something else looks like this, we need to do the right thing to get there. So that's that mentality. That's what we're trying to maintain this whole PowerPoint today. All right. Like, you can produce glucose through gluconeogenesis, but it's not a very efficient way to do it. And you're left with a whole bunch of like, excess nitrogen afterwards. Now, one of the other reasons we love carbohydrates so much, and I got to put this up, I totally forgot to put this up here. One other thing about carbohydrates is that your body loves carbohydrates so much, it actually is really good at storing those carbohydrates. And so if carbohydrates provide the body with its main source of fuel, your body wants to be able to store that source of fuel so that it can produce energy at all times. Your body's doing the same thing with fat, right? It's storing triglycerides throughout your body so they can break those triglycerides down later to use as like a fuel source. Well, the same thing is happening with carbohydrates. It's just a little bit less noticeable. We're pretty good at noticing when we've gained a little bit of fat. People start to freak out, but you're gaining and losing glycogen constantly as well. It's just held within your muscles and inside of your liver, so it's not quite as visible. We also don't hold as much of it. Whoops. So carbohydrates, the storage form of carbohydrates. The body will store carbohydrates in the form of glycogen throughout the body, right? So glycogen is going to be stored either, in sort of this wet, soupy mixture version in your muscles or in your liver. With your liver being the primary site, just because your liver is like able to really get everything where it needs to go. So another important source of energy is obviously going to be fat, right? This is the one that's like most present in our body, right? You've got definitely, like if you were to think of, if we actually remember, like calories are a unit, or how we measure the unit of energy, right? So if you think of like how many calories you've got stored in your body of carbohydrates versus how many calories in your body you've got stored as fat, you've got way more fat stored energy. Anytime you had excess calories, your body, and it didn't have any reason to convert those excess calories into glycogen as a storage form, it'll instead convert them to fat in a storage form. And that's what your body does. You got to remember that your body is like a closed system. If you only burn 2,000 calories, but you bring in 2,500 calories, that 500 calories either needs to be burnt up as energy, meaning you need to do 500 calories worth of work, but maybe it was a long day and you were already tired, and so you just went to bed, right? And so that 500 calories has to go somewhere. It can't just like disappear. So your body is going to, if it's from a carbohydrate source, it'll convert it into glycogen and store it. But if it's from any of the other sources, or if your glycogen stores are already full, your body will convert that into fat, and it will store it in your fat cells. And that's really a big part of our conversation when we get into our nutrition class. We're going to look at like that energy in versus energy out, and understand like how our body gains weight or how our body loses weight. Because the other opposite is true as well, right? If you burn 2,500 calories, but you only consumed 2,000 calories, well, your body didn't just shut down, right? It had to get 500 calories worth of energy from somewhere. It's either going to get it from your fat stores or from your glycogen stores, or maybe it'll break down existing protein throughout your body, like break down muscle and convert that into glucose and use it to produce ATP. That's definitely the least preferred method, but it can definitely happen. And that's why we see that here, right? Protein is rarely used to supply energy during exercise. If it does use protein, it will do it by going through the process of gluconeogenesis, right? So we got to give gluconeogenesis its definition here, right? And that's the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrates sources such as amino acids, right? So if your body takes an amino acid, converts it into a molecule of sugar, boom, you've got exactly what you need to produce energy. So now we've kind of talked about our fuel. How's everybody feeling so far? Fuel source is pretty good. I know a lot of this is kind of reviewy, but did we say anything that people were like, wait, that's not how I thought that in my head? Anything?
No.
Cool, cool. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this high energy molecule that we're constantly obsessed with making, right? Let's take a look at ATP here. So, the main molecule we are trying to create is adenosine triphosphate, right? Or ATP. And what that is the primary source of energy for immediate cellular metabolism. So everything you do takes ATP. You need to have ATP in order to be able to do stuff. We've talked about action potentials, the way that your body opens up those pumps in order to like shoot sodium from one side to another. That is working against the natural direction that sodium wants to flow. So that takes ATP. If you push something against the direction it wants to go, it takes a bunch of energy, right? ATP is going to supply you with that energy. Those proteins inside of your muscle cells that reach up and grab each other, the actin and the myosin, right? That takes ATP. The way that like that myosin head has enough energy to reach up and grab is by breaking the ATP molecule. Everything that we do takes ATP, right? And so it is basically like the way it works is, you know, it's this little like high energy molecule and it has these 3 phosphates on the end of it. Your body will break off that 3rd phosphate and there's a bunch of energy trapped in the bond there. So when that breaks off, the energy is released, your body captures that energy and it uses it to do stuff, you know, all the stuff. Everything you do, it takes it, you know, it breaks off that phosphate and uses the energy from that phosphate to allow you to do everything. And now you've got this burnt up ATP molecule, which, you know, that doesn't have a phosphate on the end of it anymore. You know, it's got 2 phosphates now. So we're going to call that ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. So part of what we're talking about when we're talking about metabolism is how do we reattach that phosphate back onto that ATP molecule? How do we get that back on there so that we can have like another bond to break for that energy? And that's kind of what we're going to be diving into in just a minute here. But looking at adenosine triphosphate, right? It is the energy to perform work is trapped within the last bond of the final phosphate. Okay, so your body, the body breaks that phosphate and release it, releasing the energy trapped within. The body uses that energy to do work. Okay. Afterwards, we are left with adenosine diphosphate, ADP, and it has to find a way to reattach that final phosphate to create more ATP, because that is how we want to like store energy, right? That's how we want to store. We want to store it in a, you know, this version. Unfortunately, we're just not very good at like storing energy. You know, energy is too unstable for us to just kind of be able to hold on to passively. So we use ATP as a way to like store it so that we can break it off whenever we need it. A less intense version of that is also how we store glucose as glycogen and how we store fat as like fatty acids, right? Our body can like take those and use those to produce energy as well whenever there's too much energy around. But we don't want to just have too much ATP passively. So instead we have like a bunch of like fat cells that take care of that for us. And then those fat cells are like a currency, you know? It's kind of like if you were to keep some gold bars for a rainy day under your bed. You're like, I can't take this down to like Ralph's and be like, here, I'd like to buy my groceries with this gold bar. You know, like that's kind of like what fat is. But if you take it to the bank, now the bank's going to give you money. Now you've got ATP. You can take that and you can go and be like, boom, there's my money. Give me my groceries, right? So that's kind of similarly to how the relationship of like, you know, nutrients and ATP work, right? Nutrients are also, you know, energy, but they're not in a form that we can actually use them until we make them into a molecule of ATP. So this is where we look at our specific ATP energy system. So, so if we're looking at producing ATP, right? We have got 3 primary systems here. We're going to see the ATP PC system. This is going to be our first one, right? The ATP PC system. This is what we're going to be diving into tomorrow, I believe. I've got that right, don't I? I don't have the darn. Yeah, we're going to look at the anaerobic system tomorrow. I was like, this doesn't like goof around with the order or anything, does it? So we'll look more in depth at like this system tomorrow when we're looking at super high intensity. But for now, if we're talking about what the ATP PC system is, that is your adenosine adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine system. For the record, sometimes you're going to see this listed as the ATP-CP system. That is the adenosine triphosphate creatine phosphate system. Both are correct. It's just if it's creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine, it means the same thing. Another version you'll sometimes see this listed as is the phosphagen system. All of those are the same thing. They're all just nicknames for the same system. But I believe we're looking at the one that's directly in your book right now. So the ATP-PC system, this is going to be the energy system that provides energy for short duration, high intensity work by replenishing ATP rapidly. Okay, and this lasts about 6 to 10 seconds. Okay, so you can do this for about 10 seconds if you're good at it. If you're not so great at it, maybe you're not even going to last that long. And this is kind of an interesting energy system. The way this works is this actually, like, let's look at an ATP molecule here. If we look at an ATP molecule, right, you can see this is an ADP molecule. We've broken off that phosphate. There we go, right? So you are going to kick this last, oh my God, nope, this is going backwards. I can't deal with that. That one? Come on, kick it this way. There we go, perfect. All right, so we're looking at this like, you know, little chart here, right? You're gonna use a little bit of hydrolysis. By the way, that's how we break that. And what's gonna happen is that you're gonna break that phosphate off and a whole bunch of energy is gonna release. Now, if you look at the way your ATP phosphocreatine system works, what it's going to do is it's actually going to use an enzyme from creatine to reattach that phosphate right back to that molecule. So if you look at, like, let's see if I can actually find a GIF of this. This will be interesting. Phosphagen system GIF. Can I find this? Probably not. Yeah, that's okay. So the way that this works is your body is actually going to use an enzyme found in creatine called creatine kinase. Now remember, enzymes, what do? They kick off metabolic reactions, right? That's their primary purpose. So what will happen is creatine kinase will actually donate a bunch of its energy to reattach that phosphate that just got kicked off. So it's almost like a yo-yo effect, right? Imagine you've got an ATP molecule, right? You got the big adenine over here, and you got the 3 little phosphates here. And I'm gonna take, I've got this, my left hand is gonna represent my second phosphate, my right hand is gonna represent my third phosphate. So I kick off that third phosphate and a whole bunch of energy gets released. If there is creatine present in the system, it will use its enzyme to reattach that phosphate right back on. And you can just break it off, reattach it, break it off, reattach it, break it off, and reattach it. And just boom, 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 boom. And so it creates ATP super fast. I mean, creates ATP, right? Like it takes ADP and returns it to ATP. That's what's actually happening, right? It's like 2 back to 3, 2 back to 3, 2 back to 3, over and over and over. And it's like, boom, 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 boom. It is super explosive. It happens really quickly, but it's like the, you know, what's that phrase? The candle that burns the brightest also like goes out the fastest, right? That's what's going to happen here. It's super intense. It gives you a big burst of energy, and then it's completely exhausted, and it kind of has to then start creating ATP molecules from things like glucose. So we can only last about 6 to 10 seconds here, which means if we are going to like exhaust this energy system, which is the goal, right? We want to kind of exhaust the system. We need to work pretty freaking hard in order for that to happen. And so this is where you get 1 to 5 repetitions from, right? This is where you are working as absolutely hard as you can in order to like have a super, super, super high intensity. This is associated with maximal intensity exercise, right? Like I don't even like the fact that it says like high intensity work here. It should say maximal intensity work. Like glycolysis is still like high intensity, but they're going to use moderate here. But like maximal, I think that's just a much better descriptor. It is as hard as it gets. And so like associated with maximal intensity exercise, that is going to be anywhere from 1 to 5 repetitions, right? Now, in order to make sure that like you can only do 1 to 5 repetitions, you need to be lifting at the right intensity when it comes to exercise. And this is where we start tying things to our 1 rep max. If you can do 5 repetitions, that should correspond with about 85% of your 1 rep max. So let's keep these numbers simple. Let's say that I can lift 100 pounds at the most. The most I can lift when doing a deadlift is 100 pounds, okay? There it is. So if I were to lift 100 pounds, how many reps can I do? Right? That's my 1 rep max. Now, if I take that 100 pounds and I lift 2 times, is it my 1 rep max anymore? No. Still high intensity though, but not maximal intensity. Now, what if I can lift it 6 times? Well, now if I'm doing it 6 times, let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm doing a 1-1-1 tempo. It takes me 1 second to lift. I hold it for 1 second in between. It takes me 1 second to drop it down to the ground, you know? Probably takes a little bit longer than that because like, you know, this is still relatively high intensity, but just for the sake of argument, 3 seconds per rep. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, boom, there's 1 rep done. Next rep, next rep, next rep. If I do 6 reps, that's about 18 seconds under tension. So that's well outside of this ATP-PC system. That is where I've started working in glycolysis instead, right? You've only got so much creatine stored up within your muscles. That enzyme gets exhausted pretty freaking quickly. And so it can't really just continue producing energy that way. And so if I'm lifting 6 repetitions and my goal is to gain maximal strength, well, now I've started to train the wrong energy system for maximal strength. I've started to train an energy system that's pretty good at producing lactic acid as a byproduct. Does that make sense? So you're starting to see like where repetitions actually kind of come into the conversation, right? If I'm like if I'm trying to be like an Olympic level sprinter, you know, I want to hopefully be done within 10 seconds. Now, here's the other thing about the ATP-PC system. It's also not very fast to recover. And that's why we'll take 3 minutes rest, 4 minutes rest, 5 minutes rest, you know, in between sets sometimes, because like we are resting for super extended periods to ensure that like that creatine kinase, which is the enzyme, really gets filled back all the way up and is like ready to go again for round 2 or round 3. And that's also why we have to do so many sets as well, because like it takes a certain amount of like exposure to exercise in order for our body to like actually create change. So if I'm only doing 5 repetitions, well, you know, I got to make sure I'm getting close to like 30, 40 repetitions in order for my body to like, you know, get the muscle memory in and like have enough tension to like actually produce change. But again, I don't want to do 1 set of 40. That's the wrong energy system. So instead, I can do, you know, 8 sets of 5 repetitions. That would be insane, by the way. That's too much. But like if I did that, right, that would be the exposure that I need to experience change, right? So there's our ATP-PC system. Now, the next system, which is also really good, this is also still like relatively intense, is glycolysis, right? Glycolysis is going to provide energy through the breakdown of glucose to create ATP for, and we're going to say moderate intensity, moderate duration work. So that's 30 to 50 seconds. Again, I mean, you know, they're using their words. I like them. I still use glycolysis is still relatively intense, you know, like, because you're seeing like this gap here, right? Like this lasts 6 to 10 seconds, and then this one lasts like 30 to 50. Well, it's like what happens from, you know, 11 seconds up to 30, you know? Well, that's where things start to kind of blend together. It's like, well, what system are you really training? Kind of both, you know, like you might still be relying on any leftover, you know, phosphocreatine that happens to be there, but you've also like started glycolysis in the background, but maybe it's not doing most of the heavy lifting yet. Or maybe your body's really good at the ATP-PC system, so it can last 15 seconds, you know? There's really, this is where we do kind of get into a little bit more like it's kind of an art more than it is like a science, you know? Like my body, like we're about to get into like the oxidative system here in a second. My body does not like glycolysis. It's pretty good at the ATP-PC system. Like I'm pretty good at like super high intensity work, and I'm pretty darn good at long duration work. But that middle stuff, my body is like, I want to be out of glycolysis as fast as possible. And so it will kick over into aerobic really quickly. And that's just what you see in like more type 1 muscle fibers. My body likes to rely on mitochondria to produce energy rather than relying on the fluid portions of our cells to produce energy. I'm sorry, my cells to produce, I said our cells. You guys are gonna help me produce energy. That's why I give people high fives. I'm a vampire. People, I just realized like most people in this call are like, yeah, we haven't been around you much. We don't know that you give high fives. Now we're getting real meta. All right, so this is gonna be anywhere from about 30 to, oh, no. 30 to 50 seconds in duration. Now, again, if you're like a bodybuilder, right? If you're somebody who has like a lot of muscle, you're actually probably pretty good at staying in glycolysis for a long time, right? Like me, I'm a 30-second person. But if you've got like a lot of muscle on your body and your body is real good at this, you might be like a 50-second person. You might get it to last up to 2 minutes if you're really great at it, you know? And that's like what we're talking about between like, you've got your type 1, which is like, I want to run for an hour. You've got your type 2, which is going to be split into 2A and 2, I don't have letters, type 2A and type 2B, right? So 2A is like somebody who can stay in glycolysis for a really long time without switching into oxidative. And type 2B, or type 2X actually, which is, I forgot what this class refers to it as, type 2X, right? That's somebody who's staying in ATP-PC. They're like, look, we just want to produce energy really explosively, and then we're done. And I'm out. I'm just going to go take a nap. Wake me up when you need something heavy lifted again. You know? So 30 to 50 seconds in duration. And again, it's associated with moderate intensity exercise, right? So that's going to be anything from 6 to 12 repetitions, right? Now, typically, obviously, this is where sometimes things get a little misconstrued, especially when somebody lifts at the quote unquote wrong tempo. I say wrong only because it's wrong for working for this example. So what if you did 6 repetitions? Like, we go back to our scenario that I kind of made earlier. What if you did 6 repetitions and you were able to do all 6 in 3 seconds, right? Let's say it's like you're hitting a boxing bag as hard as you can. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? That was 6 reps, which I just said is associated with glycolysis, but not at that tempo, right? That tempo is definitely more like, you know, we're looking at the duration of these things, not so much tempo. But NASM does give you protocols on tempo when we look at acute variables later on, and those protocols are there to help you land for other physiologic processes, right? Like, we know that your nervous system develops stabilization when it's exposed to a repetition for a really long time. You want to develop muscle memory? Stay under tension, right? Stay under tension for a really long time. So if you move it like a slow tempo and you only did 12 repetitions, but 12 repetitions meant that it took you like, you know, 90 seconds to do it, right? That's a crazy long, like slow repetition. Well, that's good at, you know, targeting the aerobic energy system, and you're also working on muscle memory in the background over here. So it's not always about like reps. It's not always about like intensity. It does also have to do with like these other physiologic things that we're trying to target as well, right? And that's why NASM gives you specific tempos to lift at. That's why in glycolysis, we typically tend to use what is called a 2-0-2 tempo. So that's 4 seconds per rep, 2 seconds concentric, 2 seconds eccentric, no pausing, right? 1, 2, 1, 2. We basically want to stay on the move when we are working our muscles, right? We basically want to keep our muscles either shortening or lengthening at all times. Isometric contractions, they just don't have that much of a damaging effect on those little actin and myosin fibers. What we want to have happen is we want to have an actin grab it, let go, grab it, and let go. And that's creating like little bits of friction. I always like to use this analogy when I'm describing like a 2-0-2 tempo. Imagine you are holding on to like a piece of rope, like a big heavy like battle rope or something. If you just hold on to it and pull and hold it under tension, like, you know, like you're probably going to eat your hands up a little bit. You know, your hands are going to get a little worn out. They're holding like those little fibers of that rope there. You know, it's frictiony. But for the most part, you're staying put, right? Like you're not creating all that much damage. But now imagine that you pull that rope like this, and then you let it go like that, and then you pull it more like this. What's going to happen to your hands? They're going to be blistered, right? You're going to have no skin left on those hands, right? Because you are constantly creating like friction. That's one of the reasons we use a 2-0-2 tempo whenever we're aiming for hypertrophy, because it creates more damage to the actin and myosin fibers, therefore creating more inflammation. Then we pair that up. We pair that up with using glycolysis as an energy system, which as a byproduct of glycolysis creates a bunch of lactic acid, which further damages your system, right? So now we have created maximal cellular damage, and your body is going to create maximal inflammation in response. Starting to see where even more of the like stuff comes from. And Robert, you're still really new to this, but like everybody else in this call right now, you know, you guys have been through what we call our acute variables, all the rules for lifting basically. And this is what we cover in our program design classes, which we're going to get to at the end of this mod here. But you start to see like when we get like this understanding of the physiology, right? Start to get to understand like that's why they say to lift low repetitions for big muscles. But like I just said, that's technically not true. The ATP-PC system isn't even all that great for big muscles. You want big muscles? Stay in glycolysis. And so we start to see that like sometimes there's some misconceptions behind like, you know, what we actually mean. That's why intensity is a much better term than hard, right? How's everybody following that so far? We got glycolysis down?
Yes, sir.
Word up.
What was that? Was that a yes? I meant it.
Yes.
Awesome. It got cut off halfway. I was like, what? All right, oxidative metabolism. Oxidative system. This is going to be the most complex of the energy systems. And it's complex because it is a process that uses the substrates with the aid of oxygen to produce ATP. So your oxidative system, it is complex. It really is. You have to rely on both the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to produce ATP. Those two energy systems rely on the byproducts from your previous energy system in order for that to be able to happen. And that's pretty complex, right? You have to have already gone through glycolysis for the most part to have an oxidative system. Unless, like I said, with like keto, you kind of skip that process. So that's its own sort of complicated thing there as well. And there's also aerobic glycolysis, which is like the glycolysis that's taking place on the inside part of that membrane, but still using like the same, a very, very similar process there. So your oxidative system is basically associated with long duration work, right? So this is going to be a duration of 2 minutes or greater. And again, you might be saying, whoa, 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 what happened to 51 seconds up to, 119 seconds, right? Like what happened to all that time in between? Again, some people can stay in glycolysis longer. A blend does start to occur here. And so this is associated with, with low intensity exercise. And that's going to be 12 to 20 repetitions. Now, again, I want to put an asterisk next to that. If you did 20 repetitions in 8 seconds, well, that's going to be somewhere between these two, It is definitely duration-based more than it is rep-based. But if you're also following some of our other rules about lifting tempo, then you will land in these energy systems effectively. All right, so I love this chart. This chart right here is one of my favorite charts in your whole textbook. And this is actually showing you where your energy is coming from the fuels, like through these energy systems. What I really like about this is it kind of highlights the fact that like it is a blend, It's not like it's strictly one energy system. Maybe you've been 3 minutes in and your body somehow found a little bit of creatine kinase and was like, pop, created one final ATP-PC, explosion. It's not like this stuff isn't happening underneath. It's just these are the primary systems that are taking place. So let's kind of blow this chart up here. So these are your 3 energy systems. This is kind of showing where the transfer takes place. So what we're seeing down here is exercise duration, right? So your duration. So like if you're at 10 seconds, right? Imagine this is like a run, right? You can put a little body down here in your head. This person's like off for a run, right? When they first start that run, that first 10 seconds, their energy, and this is, the percentage of where that energy is coming from, all their energy is coming from that ATP-PC system. So we'll say for the sake of argument, somebody was like asleep, like laying on the ground, and then they get up and start running, right? First 10 seconds, it's all coming from the ATP-PC system. But then that system, like I said, it gets exhausted really quickly. So there's 10 seconds, right? At that 10-second marker, now the ATP-PC system is producing less and less of the energy. They are not using phosphocreatine, or creatine kinase rather. They're not really using that enzyme to produce ATP anymore. So the amount of energy coming from it is starting to die. Well, glycolysis is just starting to get started, right? Now, glycolysis is very similar to the ATP-PC system in the sense that like it produces ATP pretty rapidly as well. Although it's not that rapid, it's not super, super fast. It still needs a little bit of time to actually do this because it's taking place in that lack of oxygen environment. Well, that glucose kind of needs time to ferment. And so it takes a little bit of time here for that to occur. So luckily you have that 10-second stopgap, right? Well, glycolysis starts to take over and starts to take over and starts to take over until eventually now it is the primary source of energy production. But do you see the aerobic system here in the background? See how it's like constantly doing a little bit of work down here in the background, right? Your aerobic system is always functioning in the background. This is why you can't survive without oxygen for very long, Yes, we produce energy in a lack of oxygen environment, like absolutely. But that's not enough energy to keep your body alive. So you need to have a little bit in the background, like constantly. And that's what you're seeing down here with your aerobic system. Now, as you start to do like work, right, your duration's like 30 seconds in, maybe it lasts up to 2 minutes. Maybe you stayed in glycolysis, right? Another one of the reasons I love this chart is because, and you would think that I would hate this, but I love it actually. it totally contradicts what we just put in our notes, right? I told you glycolysis lasts 50 seconds, right? Well, here this chart says it lasts up to 2 minutes. Yeah, it can. You know, like, everybody's actual chart's going to look a little bit different. But this is sort of a perfect scenario here. You know, this is a friggin' bodybuilder, so we're looking at, actually. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime. We're looking at his chart. And so you can see, like, glycolysis is providing most of your energy. This is still relatively intense, but eventually what's happening here, remember, what's the byproduct of glycolysis? Lactic acid. And so all this freaking lactic acid is getting built. You know, it's starting right here. You're producing lactic acid here. Now you're producing more, now you're producing as much as you can produce. And it's just sitting around, you know, taking up space, making your muscles super acidic and running through your blood, you know? And so eventually you've produced so much lactic acid and that lactic acid has had time to ferment into, you know, actually, let me go back just a little bit. I constantly say lactic acid. Technically, it's pyruvic acid, right? You've produced a whole bunch of pyruvates. Pyruvic acid has been fermenting. Now it's lactic acid. Remember, there is like that fermentation process that has to take place. Pyruvic acid has to sit in a no oxygen environment to become lactic acid. 90% of the time, guys, when you're talking about this stuff, you're just going to skip that step and just refer to it as lactic acid. But to be fair to this chart that we're looking at here, we kind of do need to refer to it as pyruvate. So pyruvic acid is fermenting and becoming lactic acid, which means your intensity is now going to have to decrease. And your aerobic system has had enough of that stuff built up that it can now use it to produce ATP for the remaining duration. And it can do it forever because this is going to continue in the same way that your aerobic system was doing a little bit of work in the background here. If this chart were to extend out further, glycolysis would be constantly taking place in the background to support your aerobic system. Glycolysis is still occurring, you know, 1 hour into ATP production. It's still happening in the background. It's just that your body is burning up its byproducts with its aerobic metabolism, but it's still there. It's still occurring in the background. It's just that you're in, and that's why you can go through, like, you can go for a run and like you're fine and you're like, I could do this forever. And then all of a sudden you start going up a hill, you need to recruit more muscle fibers to get up that hill. So you start to recruit more muscle fibers are going through glycolysis now. And so like that lactic acid production builds up. And as you're up the hill, you're like, oh my God, it's getting worse. I'm not going to make it up this hill, right? Your body has to breathe more to sort of process that lactic acid aerobically. It has to turn that lactic acid into ATP. And so that's why you start to breathe harder when you do more work. And eventually so much of it gets built up that you have to either slow down or stop in order, and while you continue breathing hard in order to convert all that stuff into ATP. Does that make sense? Everybody understand that chart pretty well?
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens in the longer duration? You know, there's training sessions that are 2.5 hours, and then some, you know, sometimes people work out longer, you know. So what happens after 2.5 hours? Is glycolysis and aerobic still the same, or does glycolysis drop and you're using mostly your aerobic after?
So it doesn't further drop. It's going to continue taking place. It's a great question. I mean, like, that's going to continue taking place in the background. I'll give you the best example.
No matter what, no matter how long.
It's into infinity, right? Until you have run out of fat on your body, right? Which is not going to happen, you know, until you've run. So let's talk about like a marathon, right? Anybody in here ever marathoned? Anybody in the call? So marathoners will describe this thing called hitting the wall. And remember, like, primary, so we've talked about our energy source. Well, where does that fuel come from? Well, if it's glycolysis, it comes from glucose, right? Glucose is the fuel source. And if it's your aerobic metabolism, fat is actually the primary fuel source, right? But we have like a mixture happening constantly, right? Go back to that respiratory exchange ratio that we talked about. I'm going to pull that up here, actually. Let's pull up that respiratory exchange ratio, right? Where's the one I want? No, not that one. There we go. This is the one. Okay. So here we're looking at it, right? If you are at complete rest, fat is actually providing the fuel to keep your body alive, not carbohydrates. But if you are at super high intensity, right, this is your exchange ratio is 1-to-1. 1 unit of oxygen goes in, all of it gets used, 1 unit of CO2 comes out. Your percentage of fuel is 100% coming from carbohydrates. So if my duration is less than 2 minutes, because my intensity is really high, where did most of, my intensity was high, where did my source of fuel come from? It came from carbohydrates. But let's look at a marathon, right? My duration is 4 hours, right? I'm at it for a long time. So, but I'm not sprinting that whole 4 hours, right? I'm jogging it. So what's happening, let's say I'm at like a 0.9, right? A good chunk of my carbohydrates are providing like fuel, right? And I'm 10% of the oxygen that I inhale isn't getting used. I'm exhaling 10% of it, right? That's pretty high intensity. And then only 30% of my energy is coming from fats. So that's actually pretty intense. The problem with working this intense during a marathon actually is I'm burning through carbohydrates really, really quick. So there's a moment that a marathoner will tell you about, and it's called hitting the wall. And hitting the wall is where you officially run out of like carbohydrates stored in your body. Go back to talking about glycogen earlier. We store it in our liver, we store it in our muscles, right? And that's how we have stored high intensity fuel. We've got our jet fuel stored and we got our unleaded, we've got carbs and we've got fat. If you burn through carbohydrates too quickly during a marathon, you will actually get exhausted and you're going to hit the wall too quickly. Your body will actually start burning protein to convert into carbohydrates to give you carbohydrates to keep up the current pace that you're going at. And by the way, like glycogen weighs, stuff. It weighs, I don't know how much it weighs, but it has like its own weight to it. And so like, obviously you're sweating when you're working out, so you're losing water, but if you lose weight too rapidly during like, let's look even beyond a marathon, let's look at like an Ironman, right? Ironman triathlon, they make you weigh in at stations. They don't just like make you stop to like drink, but they test your weight. And if you drop weight too quickly, they'll kick you out of the race. They'll pull you out. And they do that because like when your body produces, eats muscle for energy, there's a bunch of nitrogen as a byproduct and it can wreck your kidneys. And so like you could die mid-race, and that's why they do that. They're like, we don't want your kidneys to shut down. You lost too many pounds between checkpoint 13 and checkpoint 14, you're out, and so like that kind of, and the reason I bring this up, Maggie, is like hopefully that highlights the fact that like both of these energy systems are taking place simultaneously. Like one's always taking place under the other one, because you can't do this one without the byproducts from this one. But the problem is what happens when those byproducts are greater than the product, right? Like ideally, I would produce lactic acid in glycolysis, and my aerobic metabolism would use that lactic acid to produce ATP. But what happens if I produce more lactic acid than I can process? Like, let's say I just don't have enough hemoglobin in my red blood cells because I didn't do enough training. Let's say I don't have enough oxidative enzymes because I didn't do enough training. Let's say I didn't eat enough B vitamins because my diet sucked. Well, then the Krebs cycle is going to be kind of inefficient. So what ends up happening instead, I get less ATP output and I get lactic acid that just sits around. And I start to get tired and I'm like, I hate this. I feel like crap. I don't want to do my cardio anymore.
That actually happened to me before.
Right? Yeah, there we go. And this is where
I was marching in a protest for 6 hours and I lost like 5 pounds.
Oh yeah, did you get cranky too?
Yeah.
Yeah, man. There's definitely like now, and this part of it's outside of my depth. But like there is definitely like some like I'm sure autonomic psychological things that are like purposefully make you feel emotional and like irritated because like what that will do is that will lead to you going to McDonald's. You know, like I am sure that is like a control. This is why people get so discouraged with exercise. And like what you experience is exactly like part of why exercise is so hard for some people is because like that part of their brain gets turned on a little too quickly because a big common mistake that people who are new to cardio make is they go too hard too fast and they target the wrong energy system and they're like, I can't run long distance. And it's like, no, that's not true. You just went too intense. You were by the way, you were 6 hours?
Yeah, it was about 6-7 hours. I didn't really count, but it was a long time.
Yeah, that's intense,
Yeah.
man. Yeah, actually, no, it's not intense, but it's hard. Man, that's rough. Yeah. So hopefully that kind of highlights what we're talking about here. So and this is another thing that you want to measure. Like this is why we have like pacing available too. You don't want your athlete to burn through energy too quickly. Like and it's like, hey, you need to slow down a little bit. Bring your intensity back. You're burning carbs right now, and you're gonna hit the wall early. And like it's brutal, you know, like you got to remember, like this is why like marathoners have all those gels and goos, you know, that basically it's like pure glucose. That way it's instantly broken down by the body and it can just be absorbed by your bloodstream, but that still takes time. So if you if you burn all that off before that fuel hits your bloodstream, you're not gonna be able to produce ATP in your muscles. You're gonna start cramping and your body's gonna shut down. So there's definitely like reasons to kind of keep an eye on this stuff. This also explains why like some people do like blood doping, you know. You look at blood doping, like that's what Lance Armstrong got caught for, right? He was basically like, you know, he was not only taking like a drug that makes more red blood cells, but he was also donating not donating, but pulling his blood out of his body and then putting it back in his body later so that he would have more red blood cells. More red blood cells carries more oxygen. His body can convert greater levels of lactic acid. So he can just eat glucose all day and, you know, convert it into lactic acid and, you know, he can stay ahead of the curve, which is great sounding, but incredibly dangerous because it makes your blood thicker. And then your heart's like, you know, squeezing really hard and can explode. So not safe. All right, so let's go ahead and look at like let's look at how to train these systems, right? Let's talk about like how we can actually do all this, right? So we've looked at ATP, we've looked at producing ATP. Let's go back through the systems here and look at how training affects them, which we've verbally been talking about this whole time, but let's get it into our notes. So the ATP-PC system. The energy within the ATP molecule is used immediately for a muscular contraction. So you're left with this little phosphocreatine afterwards, right? Phosphocreatine is basically like a little enzyme that will donate itself to reattach that phosphate, right? So here's what we're seeing here, right? Imagine you've got ATP production has already happened before this picture starts. You had an ATP molecule, you kicked off that phosphate, and you are left with an ADP molecule, and you happen to have some phosphocreatine, right? You have creatine, which is something your body naturally produces. It's also something you can take as a supplement, by the way. And this is one of the very rare examples of like where I will tell you that a supplement is in all trials that's ever been used in, been proven to be very effective. Creatine is one of the few supplements that I think we have concrete, solid proof in its efficacy. It works. For this energy system. Now, if you're trying to use it for cardio, it's not going to do anything for you. You know, it'll make the first 5 seconds of your cardio faster. Yay. But it's great for heavy lifting. So you have an ADP molecule because that other phosphate got burnt off, right? And you're left with a molecule of creatine. Your body will use the enzyme creatine kinase, which we're seeing CK here, to break the creatine off, which it will do through hydrolysis, by the way. So you're going to be left with a big water molecule here, and you're left with the phosphate that was attached to that creatine molecule. And so what it'll do is it will attach that phosphate back over here, leaving you with 3 phosphates, and that is called ATP, and you're left with a little bit of creatine afterwards. And your body can take that creatine and reattach its own phosphate later on, and go through this whole process again later. So again, it's basically using this little enzyme to reattach a phosphate over and over and over and over and over again. Boop, 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 boop. Right? Bunch of energy gets released. By the way, this is very much a hydrolysis thing. Whenever you break an ATP molecule, that takes hydrolysis, right? So you're left with water afterwards. Well, here's the thing. That also happens in using using creatine kinase. So that also creates more water production. So if you are taking creatine as a supplement, has anybody ever used creatine? Anybody in the call? Totally.
I have.
Yeah, it's great, right? It's really effective if you're doing heavy lifting. So if you're taking that stuff, the one thing you do need to be aware of, though, is it will result in a lot of water weight.
Water weight.
Yeah, man. I remember the first time I took creatine, like regularly, like I gained like 5 pounds in like 3 days. And it wasn't because like my muscles just went, it wasn't that. It was just my body was like, good God, we have a lot of water left over afterwards. And so you get a lot of water weight. And that's actually kind of a good thing. I don't want to go too much into this because it's not really what we're talking about today, but that's actually a good thing because now, again, there's more, your muscles are inflated with that water. There's more inflammation, which has been shown to also result in more hypertrophy. Your muscles sort of get the memory of being larger. And so you are actually more like creatine is really effective for heavy lifting. It's also pretty effective for hypertrophy gains as well. All right, so we got to go back though. I gotta finish up the notes here. So here's what's happening, right? In the ATP PC system. No, it's all messed up. Ah. No. All right. The energy within the ATP molecule is going to be used. And this is also a very anaerobic system, by the way. This is also taking place in a non-oxygen environment. So what happens is a phosphocreatine hydrolysis, right? So again, hydrolysis coming in to break it up, regenerates ATP by giving its phosphate to ADP to resynthesize. We're going to say to resynthesize ATP, right? So phospho will use hydrolysis to regenerate ATP by giving its phosphate to an ADP molecule to form ATP, okay? The enzyme responsible for this is called creatine kinase. Okay, creatine kinase is the enzyme that allows that to occur. So all forms of intense exercise, such as sprinting, heavy weightlifting, gymnastics, are all possible because of, and again, they're using a different word here, thanks for that, the phosphagen system, right? So heavy weight lift, high intensity exercise predominantly relies on the ATP PC system. Weightlifting, gymnastics, sprinting, right? All those are really good examples. So then we got our glycolytic system, which I guess is another way to say glycolysis. It's probably the different, I'm no English teacher, but it's the different tense. But your glycolytic system, glycolysis, right? We'll put it here, glycolytic system. Is also an anaerobic process, right? This is a non-oxygen process, and this is a great way. Like this is breaking down like what I should have been saying earlier, which is like it's the metabolic pathway that converts glucose into pyruvic acid and ATP, right? Pyruvates, and so I'm just going to rewrite this just slightly, but this is the metabolic process that converts glucose into pyruvic acid or pyruvates and ATP, right? So you're going to get 1 molecule of glucose will net 2 molecules of ATP and 2 molecules of NAD, right? NAD will then be converted into pyruvic acid and eventually lactic acid. Okay, so that NAD, that's the pyruvate that we're talking about, right? So it will get converted into pyruvic acid, and then as it's in a non-oxygen environment, it will ferment. You guys have experienced fermentation. You know, fermentation results in like that sour taste in sourdough bread. That's because of fermentation. What you do is, and I don't know, you know, the pandemic created a million people who were making their own bread because we thought we weren't going to have any groceries. And I totally fell into that. I didn't actually do it, but I did watch videos on how to do it because I was fascinated. So now I feel like I'm a sourdough bread expert who's never made a bowl of sourdough in his life. But you would take, you know, flour, bunch of carbohydrates, right? All it is just a bunch of sugar molecules. And you put it in there with a little bit of water. So now you're able to do a little bit of hydrolysis. And then you add in some yeast, which is basically like live freaking bacteria. And that bacteria is like an animal, you know, it's like an animal, just like, you know, we're a clump of cells that need to breathe, right? Well, bacteria is a clump, are just cells that need to like breathe as well. So what you do is you put that yeast in there, and you know, that bacteria is like, oh, awesome, look at all this sugar, look at all this oxygen, I've got everything I need to like produce energy and live as a healthy bacteria. And so it starts to like live and have its life, and then you monster, you suffocate it. You put the lid on your sourdough bread jar, you cover it with a saran wrap or something, and you suffocate the poor bacteria, and sure enough, they all start to ferment. And that's how we make beer and wine and sourdough bread and kimchi and yogurt, all of anything that's fermented, kombucha, all that stuff. That's all basically just like a fermentation process, right? Well, if you have ever left your protein shaker in the car and you forgot about it, and you were a big dummy and you decided to open that lid, and it's like that scene out of the Raiders of the Lost Ark when they open the Ark and it melts all their faces off, right? Like that is because all of the bacteria in your protein shaker was living and eating off of that protein shake, and it ate all the oxygen that was inside of there, and it spit out all kinds of carbon dioxide. And that's also why, by the way, if you know when you pop that lid off and it's like boom, it comes shooting off of there, right? Just like in kombucha, when you open the lid, it like comes popping off, right? That's because there's all kinds of carbon dioxide. All that bacteria exhaled its carbon dioxide and filled up all that space. And so you had a lid on there that wasn't getting any larger, and all of a sudden, boom, space, right? So that all converted all of that energy. There's a ton of energy that got released. That's happening within your cells. Your cells are a non-oxygen environment, just like your protein shaker once all of that oxygen gets eaten up. It's a non-oxygen environment. So it ferments, and that fermentation process makes something that's pretty acidic. Well, luckily, that acid gets to be used for ATP later on, but it's also the stuff that makes our muscles burn like crazy. And that's why your eyes watered when you open it. And that's what gives it its wonderful taste, you know? We love fermentation. You know, I had some yogurt this morning in my oatmeal. So let's go ahead and look at what we're talking about here. So this is going to kind of summarize everything we've talked about. This is kind of an older video, but it does a really good job of talking about these energy systems. And my computer is lagging. Okay, don't do that.
While ATP is the fuel that supplies the energy for muscles to work, unlike some other types of fuel you might be familiar with, it's not a case of simply filling up the body's tank with ATP and off we go. In fact, the body has 3 different energy systems, and they all work together to enable our muscles to contract and allow us to perform an incredible range of movements. The first 2 energy systems we'll examine are called anaerobic energy systems. That is, they function without oxygen. Firstly, the ATP-PC system. PC stands for phosphocreatine. Let's look more closely at an ATP molecule. Its molecular diagram looks like this. When the energy from an ATP molecule is released, one of the phosphate groups, consisting of 1 phosphorus atom and 3 oxygens, splits away. The remaining molecule is known as ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. Its molecular diagram looks like this. But when PC, or phosphocreatine, which is also found in muscle cells, reacts with ADP, it donates a phosphate group to the ADP molecule, and an ATP molecule is again formed. When PC gives off its phosphate group, a molecule known as creatine is left. For this reaction to take place, an enzyme called creatine kinase must be present. This series of reactions is the basis of the ATP-PC energy system. ATP synthesizes to ADP and resynthesizes to ATP with the help of PC molecules and the enzyme. These reactions take place very quickly inside the muscles, and because PC is stored in the muscles, it is the first energy system used during high-intensity physical activity. The muscles only store about 10 seconds worth of PC, so any physical activity that involves quick, short bursts of energy makes heavy use of the ATP-PC system. When the 10 seconds worth of PC is used up, muscles start relying on the second anaerobic energy system for the bulk of their energy. This second anaerobic energy system is known as the lactic acid system.
Glycolysis.
It works by synthesizing new ATP molecules from glycogen, which is the stored form of sugar in our bodies. The reaction is known as glycolysis, and because it doesn't involve oxygen, it's called anaerobic glycolysis. Through a complex series of reactions, glycogen breaks down into ATP and lactic acid. This anaerobic glycolysis occurs when muscles are working above their lactate threshold, something we'll look at in more detail later in the program. As lactic acid builds up in our muscles, they begin to hurt and feel stiff, and this serves as a signal that our muscles are wanting a rest. Anaerobic glycolysis is the basis of the lactic acid energy system. During high intensity exercise, it takes about 10 seconds to really kick in and lasts about another 20 seconds or so before the third system starts to play the most important part in providing muscles with the energy they need.
All right. And then we're going to look at that next part. Well, I'm going to walk you through it first, then we're going to watch the video afterwards. Oh boy, the camera freaked out again. All right, so let's look at our oxidative system. This one's very intense. Well, I mean, it's very complicated compared to the other systems because it does have sort of a lot of different reactions here. And then obviously it's relying on byproducts rather than just an immediate fuel source. And so we have our oxidative system, which is going to rely on aerobic glycolysis, which is glycolysis that is taking place in like an oxygen environment. This is taking place like, it's still producing ATP the same way. It's just doing it with a much more oxygen-rich area, right? This is also going to be the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, okay? So this is where we do want to mention this really quickly. Your body will start to metabolize, like, again, we were talking about fuel earlier, right? Both of these systems really kind of rely on glucose as a fuel source. This long duration, low intensity stuff is actually going to rely a little bit more on fat as a fuel source. So fat can also be metabolized here. And it has to, in order to be able to do that, produce acetyl-CoA, which acetyl-CoA, you might remember, right? Acetyl-CoA is what's going to go through your Krebs cycle, right? So glucose gets broken down into pyruvate, leaving you with lactic acid and acetate, right? And then what that does is that becomes acetyl-CoA, right? And now that acetyl-CoA will go through the Krebs cycle. So we need to get acetyl-CoA. We can get it directly from metabolizing fats. So your body can go through this process called beta oxidation, where it takes a fat molecule with and then goes through an oxidation reaction, leaving you with acetyl-CoA. Now you can start at the Krebs cycle. So you could skip these processes by using fat as a fuel source. Oh, good Lord. Hold on one second. Dogs. All right. So that's your oxidative system, right? So this produces a lot of ATP, but it's producing it very slowly. Like you're getting many ATP molecules from this system, you're just getting them slowly, right? The other one was like producing like boom, 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 super, super fast, but you weren't getting very much ATP. You were getting you were getting ATP and some byproducts. Well, those byproducts are going to go through this system, and that's going to produce a whole bunch of ATP. But you have to wait for those byproducts before you're able to do that. And that's why this is much more slowly in comparison. So let's go ahead and look at that actually.
The aerobic energy system works by supplying oxygen to the muscles. This is the most complex of the three energy systems and requires the heart, lungs, and whole circulatory system to work. After about 30 seconds of intense physical activity, the aerobic energy system becomes the main source of energy. It is at this point that large quantities of oxygen carried by the blood becomes available to the muscles. The presence of available oxygen to the muscles allows a process known as aerobic glycolysis to take place. This process uses the large stores of glycogen in the body, which is synthesized into ATP. Water and carbon dioxide are byproducts, which the muscle cells expel via the blood. This expulsion of the waste products prevents muscles from becoming fatigued in a short period of time. With the heart and lungs working harder to move greater volumes of oxygenated blood around the body, aerobic energy allows the muscles to keep on working and working. As well as using glycogen as the basis for ATP synthesis, the aerobic energy system can also use the body's fat. However, this requires large amounts of oxygen, so for moderate to intense physical activity, glycogen is the preferred source of ATP. But after about 2 hours of continuous aerobic activity, glycogen is all used up and fat takes over as the source of ATP synthesis.
That's hitting the wall. You're out
Marathon
of
runners
carbs.
say they can detect when this occurs in the body and refer to reaching that point as hitting the wall.
Ha!
Because greater amounts of oxygen are used in breaking down fat, less is available to working muscles, and athletes must rest or slow down. In extreme events, such as famine, body fat can also become totally used up, and protein then becomes the source of ATP synthesis. The aerobic energy system requires heart, lungs, and circulatory system to provide oxygen to muscles. Aerobic glycolysis synthesizes ATP from glycogen. Water and CO2 are byproducts, which leave the cells via blood flow. The aerobic system becomes the dominant energy source after about 30 seconds of intense activity and can sustain around 2 hours of continuous aerobic activity. After this point, fat becomes the main source of ATP synthesis.
For the record, 2 hours is not NASM's stance. NASM's going to say 90 minutes. If you ever see that particular like stat where it's like how long does it take to run out of glycogen stores? It's about 90 minutes. That's why we want our workouts to be, 90 minutes or shorter in terms of like how long our session should be. If you're doing any longer than that, you're tapping into your glycogen stores. Not only are you now metabolizing something that is not really something we're aiming for, you are also reducing the effectiveness of your workout like the next day. And that's why like post-workout nutrition is so important, but we're not getting into nutrition until the next class. So here are a few principles that we want to remember in general. These principles here are going to be sort of the key takeaways from this whole PowerPoint today. But these are just some general energy during exercise. These are the big things we want to remember. Your duration and intensity are inversely related. Those of you who have been through our program design classes, you've heard me say that before, but intensity and duration have an inverse relationship. As intensity climbs, duration will fall, and vice versa, right? So the amount of energy from stored ATP is pretty limited, right? You're going to run out of that pretty quick. That's why it only lasts about 10 seconds. Whereas the energy from carbohydrates has like a super high capacity, but it is still limited. You've only got so much glycogen you can store on your body, but essentially the amount of energy that you have from fat is unlimited. Like even if you were, like let's say you're 150 pounds and you've got 5% body fat, right? Really low percent body fat, right? What is that, 150 pounds? Times 0.05. So you got 7.5 pounds of fat on your body. There are 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. You've got 26,250 calories stored on your body just in that much. And like, think about the last time you burned 26,000 calories during a workout, because I can't. Right? So it's essentially unlimited. Like, obviously it's not actually unlimited, but you know, for the most part, it's unlimited. We've got calories from fat for days, literally. So the bioenergetics of how you do that is very important. Like, you know, we even saw in the video, you know, the video showed like where people were experiencing like famine, and you could see like very low muscle mass, right? That's somebody who basically ran out of glycogen for ATP production, and they had to rely, you know, they also don't have very much body fat, so their body started relying on protein. Your body really tries to avoid using protein as a fuel source as often as possible. But it will tap into that because that energy does have to come from somewhere. You know, there's no way to do work without fuel. So your body, you know, if you continue doing work, your body will find fuel from somewhere. So that's an important one to remember. And then there are some things that result in like a greater energy burn than others, right? Like lying supine, laying on your back, burns less calories than standing up. So if your priority is to burn as many calories as possible, you should have your client on their feet as often as you can. The other thing we need, so that's a big one. So body position plays a big role in how much energy is being used during exercise. And what we mean by that is like laying down burns less than sitting upright, sitting, good Lord, upright burns less than standing. Standing in a stable environment burns less than standing in an unstable environment, you know? So that's where we start to like look at some of these principles here. I think some of the times, like some of the sneaky ways that you can be a more effective trainer is just figuring out silly ways to get your clients to burn a little bit of extra energy. I used to do this workout, and by the way, really quickly, I want to put an asterisk next to this. You would never, ever, ever, ever do this with a client who has blood pressure problems. But I used to do this workout that was like an exercise on the ground, an exercise on your feet, an exercise on the ground, an exercise on, and it was just like constantly like, and it was a great way to burn a ton of calories. My clients were always surprised. They'd have their Fitbits and they were like, how did I burn that many calories? It's only been an hour. And it's like, well, it's like, I do push-ups, I do squats all the time. And it's like, you know, the trick was the fact that they had to get off the mat, they had to get off the mat, on the mat, they had to get off the mat, then back on the mat, up, down, up, down, up, down. All that like getting to their feet, all that stuff burned a bunch of extra energy. Again, really quick, for the record, if your client has like knee problems or arthritis, do not do that type of working out. If your client has like blood pressure problems, do not do that type of working out. You're going to make your client either pass out or break something. But if they're healthy, go for it. It's a great way to burn a bunch of sneaky calories. All right, and lastly, this whole PowerPoint has been building to my favorite concept. In the world of working out, one of my favorite concepts is this one right here. It's called EPOC. So excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC, is a elevated oxygen consumption after strenuous exercise. Okay, so the body will continue to burn an elevated amount of calories in response to intense exercise. So here's what's really cool about EPOC and why I love it so much. So let's look at HIIT training, high intensity interval training, right? If anybody's ever done that, it is where you go through periods of super high intensity and you pair it with periods of super low intensity to recover. And they have had people, you know, they've measured their statistics going in, and they've had people go and burn the same amount of calories for X number of weeks. So like, we know that there's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. So what they've done is they've taken two groups of people, they've put them on the same diet, and they made both groups burn the same number of calories. But group A burned those calories through HIIT training, and group B burned those calories through steady state cardio. So like, Ironically, the HIIT training group had to do more cardio because you actually burn less energy in like the specific amount of time, but because like the low intensity recovery periods, like they need to recover, so they end up like walking a lot, and that's just not a very high calorie burn. So their workouts were longer in a weird way. But the other group, they both burned the same amount of calories, and the group that did HIIT training lost close to twice as much weight. That's a huge difference. And they saw greater muscle gain and more fat burned. So I said weight, most of their weight was fat. The other group lost weight, some of their weight was muscle. So now, like, we're really seeing a big physiologic difference. So why is HIIT training so much more effective? Well, let's go back to understanding our fuel sources, right? Remember, high intensity, carbohydrates as a fuel source. Low intensity, fat as a fuel source. Now, what's weird is, like, based on what I just said, your brain should immediately go, well, then the low intensity group should have burned more fat, and the high intensity group shouldn't have gotten any results. They burn carbs. We want to burn fat off. Why did the high intensity group lose more fat even though they were using carbs as a fuel source? Well, they did because of EPOC. Thanks to excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, their body burned more calories after intense exercise. So what happened, and you guys have experienced this, you can experience EPOC in the short term if you just think about the last time you were out of breath, right? Like you were running and you were out of breath and you're like, and then like maybe you stopped and you like stop, you're like, you're still breathing hard even though you're standing still, right? That is EPOC. It's because you're not going like, cool, I'm done, right? Like your body doesn't just stop and recover instantly, right? You have to burn off all that lactic acid. But now you're in a very fat burning environment. So what's funny is like after intense exercise, your body can actually burn elevated calories for up to 72 hours, 3 days later. Now, remember that exchange ratio, right? Percentage of calories from carbs, percentage of calories from fat, and we're always just moving those things around, right? Well, there's one time a day where you are burning all of your calories from fat. Happens once a day. Well, it can happen twice a day if you had a hard day. And it's when you're sleeping. If you are asleep, you are at the lowest intensity you can get. Keeping your body alive is entirely fat as a fuel source. You are relying entirely on your aerobic metabolism. But as your intensity starts to climb, you start to rely more on glycolysis because you're recruiting muscle fibers that weren't working a minute ago. And so now you're doing like more and more and more work, more and more and more work. Your fuel source is coming from carbohydrates. So as you're doing a full-on sprint, carbs are providing you with a fuel source. And that actually, and here's the thing, that burns a ton of calories, tons, right? You're working as hard as you can. So you're burning a lot of calories. But the problem is you're burning carbohydrates for calories. So you're not really losing fat, right? Well, for the record, you may not have lost fat in that moment, but you're gonna go eat after this workout, right? And your body's gonna restore all the glycogen that you just burned off. So all the energy, so you kind of did burn fat because now you can't convert any of those carbs to fat. So in the end, like, yeah, you did, but that's not really where this conversation is. I'm going to cover that later in our nutrition class. For now, let's just look at, you burned carbs for fuel. Well, now you're out of carbs. So your body needs to restore it. So it's going to do that. And we'll leave that alone. But here's the thing. You're also experiencing an elevated calorie burn, right? You're burning more calories than you were before. And now you are in the fat burning zone because you're sitting on the couch now that your workout's over, right? So now you're burning more calories than you would have because of something you did previously. And those calories are all fat calories. And that's why, like, and I always tell people this is like my catchphrase, right? This is why I love EPOC so much. Burning calories in the gym is pretty good, but burning calories in bed is way better. And then, you know, that can be left up to interpretation if you want to take that in a different direction. That's my dumbest joke.
Is that why it's good to rest after?
And that's why it's so good to rest, because like you're going through like carb burning, but you're getting an elevated calorie burn. Then you go through fat burning and you use that elevated calorie burn. Up and down and up and down. For the record, there's other things happening as well. High intensity work recruits more muscles makes more testosterone makes more muscle. So there's other hormonal things that are occurring there as well. So what's ironic is you might burn less calories in your workout, you know? You might leave the gym burning less calories than you would have, yet you will lose more weight in the end and build more muscle in the end. All because of like the way our energy systems work, right? You produced more lactic acid. That lactic acid created more inflammation, which built more muscle. You don't create much of that lactic. You burn all your lactic acid off when you're doing cardio. Long duration cardio. Sorry. Does that make sense to everybody? Freaking love EPOC. All right. And so that does lead us back to, in order to understand EPOC, we kind of got to come all the way back around to that respiratory quotient again, right? The respiratory quotient, or RQ, right? The amount of carbon dioxide, CO2 expired versus the amount of oxygen, O2 consumed, right? So at rest, we are at an RQ of 0.7. So fat is the primary fuel source. At a full sprint, we are at an RQ of 1.0. Carbs is the primary fuel source, right? And we are typically exercising at a blend of the RQ, somewhere between 0.7 and 1.0. Okay, so we're somewhere in a blend of that at all times, depending on like what your intensity, your duration, and your reps and things like that are. So that is, so the stuff we talked about today, that is as deep as NASM will actually go into bioenergetics. So, you know, we didn't break down the entire Krebs cycle today. We mentioned the Krebs cycle, right? We kept it pretty simple though. We didn't, you don't have to memorize any of those freaking enzymes, you know? Now, there are a few things that will come back when it comes to it, but those come back in the nutrition chapter, because nutrition and energy production are so interlinked. So this isn't the only time we're going to talk about this, but in terms of like how this stuff is affected by training, this is the stuff we need to focus on: intensity and duration. Those are the two most important concepts that I want you guys to pay attention to in this class. And then in nutrition, we'll look at fuel sources. And then we'll put it all together when we come to like a program design and how to actually write all this stuff up. So in summary, bioenergetics is the study of how energy is transformed through biochemical means. Metabolism, all reactions throughout the body. You're gonna be able to do metabolism because of proteins, fats, and carbs. ATP is the main energy source, and your RQ is determining whether you're using protein, carbs, or fat for energy. Hopefully protein is not being used. If you stay at that RQ of 1.0 too long and run out of carbs, well, then you'll be using protein, because protein gets turned into carbs. And that's it, guys. Freaking camera, come on. I look like a terrorist. I look like, you know, like it'll be $1 million and you can't see my face. Do you guys have any questions or comments or anything? Anything that's like worrying you about any of this metabolism stuff, or is everybody feeling pretty confident?
Feeling pretty good.
Cool.
Great breakdown.
Hope so. Yeah. Thanks, man. All right, guys. Well, I will get this video freaking uploaded now that it's 7:30 p.m. So everything will be up on Canvas here, hopefully within the next hour. I've got it all like pre-made already, so it's all sitting there just waiting to get plugged in. So it should go faster than it takes me in the morning. Yeah, that's about all I got for you today, guys. I'm gonna let everybody go.
I have.
Thank you, Brad.
All right, see you tomorrow, guys.
Good night.